Hello, I'm Dr. Molly Poorman, and I am a parishioner at St. Gerard, and I'm also a clinical psychologist. And I'm here today to talk to you as a member of our Health and Wellness Committee at St. Gerard. We are trying to continue our service throughout the pandemic, and I'm here today to talk to you about navigating the holidays during a time of the pandemic. I'm going to talk in kind of a two-part thing. Today I'm going to talk about identifying signs of emotional struggles, and then next week I'm going to talk about ways to develop coping strategies to deal with some of these additional stressors. We are living during a very difficult time. I spoke in the spring about dealing with the pandemic and how to take care of yourself while you were quarantining. And I would never have imagined at that time that I would be talking to you again now, 6 months later, dealing with some of the same kind of issues and then having that complicated by dealing with the holidays. So one of the things that this has taught me is that every day we learn new things about the virus, and we have to develop new ways to cope. This is particularly important coming into the holiday season. I think most people would tell you that they really enjoy the holidays, and that but it's a time that can be very stressful. I often compare it to when I was working and my kids were little. I would be so excited on the drive home, excited to see them, excited to see what they'd been up to all day. And about 5 minutes after getting home, I'd think to myself, wonder why I rushed so hard to get here and to get back here, because it was chaotic and it was a lot of work. And I think a lot of people find that the holidays are like that we look forward to them all year round, but we often feel overwhelmed by the stressors or disappointed that our expectations were not met in the way that we hoped. So holidays are stressful. And people have a lot of high expectations. They work really hard planning and trying to make things work out for themselves and for family members. There's a lot more things to do during the holidays. There's shopping and decorating and entertaining. People run into stressors related to how they can afford all the additional things necessary for the holidays. They run into issues coordinating with family members and how to get everyone together at the right time and what they're going to do. And sometimes they face disappointments because things that they planned didn't go the way they wanted it to, or people they wanted to see didn't come. And so these are a lot of emotions that come up during a usual holiday season. But this holiday season, for Thanksgiving and for Christmas and the Advent season, we're going to be getting through it during a time of a pandemic. And we're going to be dealing with all the holiday stressors along with particular stressors related to COVID. And a lot of people are stressed about the virus and what that means for them and their family. People are stressed because of the money issues related to COVID and work changes and anticipating issues with that. People are really concerned about making choices for the best way to ensure the safety for themselves and their family. And we don't have clear answers. We have ideas and things certainly that we can we know are helpful, but it's hard to make decisions. What risks are worth it? What risks can we live with? What risks can't we live with? And there's often tension within families because not everyone agrees about ways to handle those kinds of things. Not everyone sees the virus in the same way and anticipates how to deal with different issues that come up with a holiday in the same way, and that can cause tension within families. Another thing that happens in the holidays is it is typically a time that families gather together, and what that looks like for our families this year is different than in years past, and some of those things are out of our control, and some of those things are choices that we make in order to ensure our family's safety. And this is particularly true for people that are older and how we incorporate them into our family celebrations and how we keep them from feeling alone and isolated. And those kinds of things, the sacrifices we're making this year to protect the lives of those we love, leave a lot of people disappointed and having to balance that disappointment with safety issues, and in a way that we haven't had to do, certainly in my lifetime. I think as a community at St. Gerard's, we often are dealing with disappointments as well. For many of us, the church has been a place where we sought fellowship, and certainly the worship at St. Gerard has changed in terms of the ability to gather with friends in the gathering space, and looking forward to the Advent season as people do things together and congregate, as you're taking things off the tree or signing up for other things you're going to volunteer for, or at a bake sale with Christmas goodies. Those things are going to be different this year. And a lot of people find comfort in the fellowship that we have at St. Gerard, and that's different certainly throughout the year, but often felt more strongly in the holiday season, since Christmas and Advent are things that we particularly celebrate in the church. And these changes and stressors lead to emotional responses for most of us. People are angry, people are frustrated, some people are lonely. Most people have more fears than they used to, and some people are experiencing anxiety and depression. These emotions that we're experiencing at a time of a pandemic are normal, and most people will experience some of those emotions at some degree. Everyone is going to be worried about some things they didn't used to worry about, but is that worry, does that mean that people are having an anxiety disorder, or is it just normal worry? Same with sadness and hopelessness, that it's normal to be experiencing some of that as you're letting go of some of your traditions, or not able to see the people you love as much, or having to make changes that you are not welcome. Those things are going to lead to people being sad. But when does that sadness transition into depression? Those are some of the things that we are going to talk about today. But the time of the pandemic makes it harder to know when everyone's worries or feelings of sadness, when is that normal and when is it a concern? I often will tell a story about the difference between some fears that are normal and when it transitions to something more concerning. If someone tells you that they're afraid of snakes, everyone thinks, oh yeah, most people are afraid of snakes. And then if you gather more information, someone says, well, I'm so afraid of snakes, I don't really like to let my children play in the yard, and we don't really like to go outside, or I don't let my kids go outside without a grown-up. And you think, well, that's, if you live in Michigan, that seems a little maybe extreme. We have garter snakes here, and they tend not to be really dangerous. So in most people, that wouldn't be the reason you wouldn't let someone play in their yard. However, if you lived in Central America in the middle of a rainforest, you might not want your children to play outside without some additional supervision, because those threats of snakes are actually a real thing there. So the context of your fear makes a difference. So as we look at fears within the time of a pandemic and sadness in the time of a pandemic, we know we need to look a little bit closer to determine when is this normal and when is it not, and when do we need to get intervention, and when do we need to just normalize some of the things. So some of the cues that tell us if the feelings we're having are reaching a more significant problem has to do with looking at the worry and the sadness and looking at the intensity of those emotions. Is this something that is maybe a little bit more than you usually experience, but not an extreme, or has it gotten to a place that it's an extreme? That tells us if this is a more serious problem. Another thing that tells us if this is a more serious problem is if we get little relief from the emotions. So rather than it being something we think about a couple times a day or have more often, is this something that we are experiencing all the time? That sadness or that anxiety and worry is something that's present in everything we do. That not getting a break from it is an indication that it's becoming a more significant problem. Another thing that lets us know if it's become a more significant problem is if it's interfering with our functioning. Are we not able to go to work because of our worry or sadness? Are we not able to engage in relationships with the people we care about? Is it affecting our ability to take care of ourselves and others? That gives us some indication if it's gone from what would be normal kinds of increased negative emotions during a pandemic to something that means it's a more significant problem. Another thing that I often talk to people about when we're looking at issues of sadness and worry, and when it transitions to more of a significant problem, is if you're experiencing these emotions in a very physical way. that when you start to have symptoms of depression and anxiety that you experience on a physical basis, that lets us know that it's more than just a feeling, and kind of changing from the difference between a single symptom to more of a syndrome or a significant problem. And as we look at that, it may be helpful to know what more of the symptoms are, and how those things come together to make something like a diagnosis of depression or a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. And being more familiar with what those list of symptoms are can help us determine a little bit if it is something that is just normal or it's becoming more of a significant problem. One thing to keep in mind as I talk about these symptoms is no person is going to probably have all of them. And one person may struggle with anxiety or depression and have these 5 symptoms, and someone else may struggle with the same problem and have different symptoms. And you can actually get diagnosed, for example, with depression and only having one overlapping symptom. So the disorder can look very different in different people. So as you know, someone that might have it crossed over to something that seems obvious it's a more significant problem, and you think, oh, well, I'm not like them, so it must not be a significant problem. That isn't necessarily the case, because these symptoms can look very different for different people, and one isn't necessarily more concerning or less than the other. So I want to talk a little bit more about what symptoms of depression there are and what that looks like if they come together and make a more serious problem. One of the things as a therapist when I'm talking to people who come into my office worried about depression is I talk about, certainly we talk about what all the symptoms are, but one of the things that I talk about is, do people feel like the tears or the frustration are just below the surface, that they're walking around in their life and they may not be crying all the time or frustrated and upset all the time, but that they feel like it's just there, about to come out, and that something small happens. Even, you drop your purse and something falls out, or someone pulls over in front of you on the road, and that you find that just brings on this intense set of emotions. And that to me is saying that those symptoms are kind of always there and that you're handling them, but the usual things, you have no cushion for the usual things. The usual things that come up and you kind of handle them don't seem to work anymore. And that's an indication that it is moved from being just the negative feelings or a few symptoms to being more of a problem, and that you need to look for that. Sometimes people refer to that as kind of a dark cloud hanging over their heads. But those are warning signs that something more may be going on. Another thing that I often will tell people to look for in themselves and in a loved one is if you notice people starting to isolate more. Not saying they're isolating, but if you talk to them about, wanting to, meet for a Zoom call or maybe go do an outside activity that you might be able to do because it's sunny out, and they are continuing to say, no, I don't want to do that. Oh, I don't feel like that today. Maybe a different time. Do you want to do this online Bible school, or do you want to do, and that they continually back out of things that they would have usually joined in. People might not acknowledge in those situations they're actually feeling sad, but that's an indication that there's been a change, and that often will tell us that it's moved from one specific symptom to maybe a bigger problem. So to watch for those kinds of things in yourself and in loved ones. But as you're looking at a loved one and you have a reason to be concerned, or you're looking into yourself and saying, this seems like a bigger problem, what are the signs of depression that you might want to look for? What are the things there? And in that sense, we talk about depression. If you're going to have something that's moved from sadness to more depression, there has to be one of two elements there. One is there needs to be some kind of depressed mood or sadness and crying. And in children, that can be more irritability. I also notice that sometimes while it's not one of the criteria for depression, I see a lot irritability being one of the main symptoms of depression. People that are much more upset about things, and they actually will often perceive that it's changes in the world around them and think it's things happening outside of them and don't even realize that it's actually due to changes inside of them. The other thing that you have to have one of the two or the other of in order to have a diagnosis of depression is that you have to have that loss of interest in activities that we talked about. And sometimes that's harder to determine when we all have a loss of activities that we can do now. So that's harder to decide, when you don't have as many choices, is there really a change here? So that may be one thing it's harder to tell with. Then I mentioned earlier that sometimes when you experience these things physically, it's a sign of a problem. So for symptoms of depression, we talk about weight change. That can be either weight gain or weight loss. We can talk about problems sleeping, whether you either sleep too much or you sleep too little. People can have differences in their movements. You might have someone that reports a slowing and a sluggishness and that they just can't seem to get around, or someone that's just can't seem to sit still and gets really agitated. And it's not the same thing as fidgety like you might think of someone that has, distraction issues. It's really more kind of can't get comfortable, and that kind of movement that happens with that. Those are symptoms of depression. People will sometimes report a loss of energy and just a fatigue that they experience all the time, problems concentrating. Some people will report feelings of worthlessness, and people will talk sometimes about thoughts of death or dying. That doesn't mean that they're going to act on that, but it certainly is something that you would want to assess. And those things together, you have to have at least 5 of those to get diagnosed with depression. And those things together move from one particular symptom to a syndrome of depression. And those are the things we kind of want to watch for as we're looking at a pandemic when sadness is very normal. But is that sadness leading to something else? The same thing we've talked about worry and how worry is part of a pandemic and a normal component when you're worried about a virus and people's safety. But is that normal worry transitioning to something more significant? We would see signs of things like some of the physical things like an increased heart rate or sweating or shaking or rapid breathing or feeling weak. Problems concentrating, trouble sleeping, avoiding certain things. Those are all things that if you start seeing many of those things occur together, that you might become more worried. You might see some people talking about having panic attacks, or other people having repetitive thoughts that they can't shake, and then maybe repeating some behaviors that make them feel more in control, checking or doing things like that repeatedly, not just once, but that the one time they check doesn't provide them any comfort, so then they need to check again. Those kinds of things are evidence of some anxiety that's kind of gone a little too far and might need. One other thing we're noticing is that people are isolating more. And as that's happening, then some people I'm working with then start to feel themselves afraid to leave their house. Not just because of the virus, but then not wanting to be around people or getting so comfortable being at home that they don't realize how much their anxiety just about social situations have built up, and so they don't want to leave the house, even in situations that don't have risk for the virus. Another thing we sometimes notice is that people who have a history of trauma will experience triggers during a time of a pandemic that trigger their trauma. So some of those anxieties where the feeling is first the feeling of nervousness, the feeling of hypervigilance, the feeling of being afraid of the people around us. That's been one of the hardest things for me, is that all of a sudden you see people that you would say hello to and be excited to see, or even just think, oh, they're enjoying the park with me, all of a sudden now are being seen as possibly a danger to us, that they could endanger our lives. And that sense of danger can trigger people who have a history of trauma. So those things that happen, normal fears and normal feelings in a pandemic, can trigger people's anxiety that may be related to something else. And in those situations are a time that it would be helpful to reach out for more help. So those are some examples of the pieces of anxiety and depression, the feelings that are normal, but how they can become more extreme, little breaks from getting very few breaks from them, impacting your functioning, or becoming more physical and more pervasive in your life, that you might want to reach out for help. So that help can be in the way of working on coping skills. That help might be in the way of seeking professional help. And some of the difference between those two depends on the intensity and the seriousness of the problem. I'm going to talk to you in a talk next week about what are some of those coping skills that we can all use to help dealing with, whether it's the symptoms of the emotion, just the increased sadness or fear or just anger that we may be experiencing during this time of pandemic, all the way to the other end of the continuum where it is more extreme, and the things that we can do. I refer to that as someone's mental health toolbox. I look at it like a construction worker who goes out to the job site will get their tools ready before they go to the site. They'll pull their things together. They have numerous tools in their toolbox for any kind of situation that comes up. Some people are more skilled with one tool than another, but you need a bunch of different tools because no one tool will do all jobs. And that's how I look at coping skills. That one of the things that we do in a time of stress is we should really look at our toolbox and make sure we have the coping skills necessary to deal with whatever the crisis is that we are having to deal with. So next time I'm going to talk about what are some of those tools we can have in our toolbox, and getting them out and talking about them and remembering them will hopefully give you some strategies you can use if you're having struggles with this over the holidays, in particular the holidays during a pandemic. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.